English translation, 608th contact Thursday, the 15th of January, 2015, 16:02 hours.
In fact, you have arrived here ahead of me, despite me hurrying to get to the office after the correction work. And as I can see, I also have something in the fax machine which will probably be from Marianne because I faxed her an article for correction. But look here, these are the 3 articles from Bernadette, Occam, and Chris that I enclosed with the last report of conversation, as you had wished.
In that case, I want to read these first before we start talking.
Good. Then I will check what the fax contains. Yes, it is from Marianne, and if it will not disturb you while you are reading, then I will sit down in front of the computer and make the corrections to the articles.
Do according to your mind.
Well then.
What I have read I regard as good and right.
I think so too. With that the case, we can now start to talk. Look here, this is also from Marianne, an excerpt from the internet. It is about a founding member of Charlie Hebdo in the magazine Nouvelle Aube, and on the internet posthumously accusing the shot-to-death editor-in-chief Stéphane Charbonnier, alias Charb, in the following way. Reproaches from a founding member of Charlie Hebdo. The editor-in-chief, Stéphane Charbonnier, who was shot dead by terrorists last week, would have his team on his conscience. He would have driven them to their deaths. This is the opinion of Henri Roussel 80, who has worked under the name Des Fails d'Eton for the satirical magazine. At that time it was called Hara Kiri Hebdo, since the 1970s. Accusing his murdered colleague posthumously. Why did you have to overdo it? He said he had warned Charb time and again, but he had been a stubborn pighead who had already overdone it with the Mohammed cartoons in 2011. Afterwards, an arson attack on the editorial office occurred. A year later, in September 2012, the magazine published similar caricatures. Charb would have overdone it with the provocative drawings. I really hold that against you, said Roussel, addressing his late colleague. Of course, this criticism in the magazine Nouvelle Aube, which in my opinion is justified, does not go down well with the other members of the Charlie Hebdo editorial team. So says a certain Richard Malika, a long-time lawyer for the magazine. Charb has not even been buried as yet, and Aubes can think of nothing better than to publish a polemical and malicious piece. That the irresponsible elements, that is to say, the makers of Charlie Hebdo, refuse to accept the truth that was expressed in clear words. That is just absolutely and equally clear as that they do not care a cold jot about the effective truth. Consequently, they, in their unrightfulness, still believe themselves to be in the right. And what must also be said about the funeral march of the heads of state and other politicians is the fact that the whole thing was only a funeral march of hypocrites, which in truth took place far apart from the real funeral march of the huge mass of human beings in an insignificant side street. The mighty ones held their own sham funeral march with less than 100 persons in attendance. The mightful ones of states and politicians who were part of it got protected by many security guards, and for this, the normal people had no access. In this way, the whole world public was deceived by the mightful ones of state, mucked around with, and made to believe that they, the top politicians, would pull together and participate in the same mass mourning movement as thus the people. So here too, the sleazy politics is proven of those who consciencelessly dumb down the people, make them stupid, and classify them as intellectually and rationally of moderate means. And this applies quite obviously and without exception to all heads of state and other politicians who took part in this hypocritical fraud funeral march in Paris. Look here, this can be found on the internet.
The Parade of Hypocrites of Paris.
The masses took this Sunday in Paris to the streets for freedom of speech. Also, several heads of state participated in it. But among them were some black sheep. Arm in arm, François Hollande, Angela Merkel, Simonetta Sommaruga, and other leading politicians from all over the world marched in Paris on Sunday and showed solidarity with the victims of the Islamist attacks. But the gesture did not go down well with everyone. There was thus talk of hypocrisy in the social media because the morning march was also attended by politicians, who themselves are not so particular about freedom of the press. Now another point is causing a stir. The published pictures lead us to conclude that the heads of states and governments were leading a large amount of human beings. But, as the English Independent reports, the politicians were not at all part of the millions of human beings who took part in the rally. The pictures were taken in a secluded side street that was blocked off at both ends, it is reported.
20-minute in Zurich, Monday, the 12th of January, 2015.
On the way in an empty street on Twitter, pictures from TV stations are circulating that show the scene from a slightly farther distance than the official photos. Behind the little group, an empty street can be seen with solely the security personnel standing there. According to the French newspaper Le Monde, the pictures were taken on the Place Léon Blum. Afterwards, it is said, the top politicians got back into their cars and drove away. Merely President François Hollande and Prime Minister Manuel Valls took part in the actual rally on the Place de la République. Twitter users are now criticizing the heads of government. This is what pseudo-solidarity looks like, writes, for example, Jerry Hassan. Seems like the world leaders are not actually leading the demonstrators at all, tweets Borzu Daraghi. The Parade of Hypocrites of Paris, 20 Minuten CH on 2015-2/01/11/21. 43 hours. Dishonest heads of state. Daniel Wickham, Angela Merkel, Petro Poroshenko, Sergei Lavrov, Mahmoud Abbas, Benjamin Netanyahu, Ahmet Davutoglu, Simonetta Sommaruga, David Cameron, Matteo Renzi, President François Hollande, and other heads of state and politicians of various countries. The hypocritical fraud is being fiercely discussed on the Internet, whereby also various photographs prove clearly and evidently that the heads of state and other politicians only organized a hypocritical, bogus morning march, and, as usual, led the people around by the fool's rope. And the fact that thereby this disgraceful fraud committed against the public and the victims is still being excused on the Internet in the following way is probably the pinnacle of all infamy and depravity. From a security perspective, however, this arrangement appears altogether to make sense. Such a large and at short notice assembled group of top politicians from all over the world could hardly have been protected in the midst of the demonstrators. Still, the highest terror alert level is in effect in France. 10,000 soldiers are to protect against imitators and freeloaders.
To say more in this respect about it is not really necessary, because what has been explained says everything about how lowly intelligent and simple-minded the people are taken for by certain mightful ones of state and politicians, or at least by those who took part in this fraudulent morning march, and in whose faces neither sympathy nor grief could be recognized. The only thing that remains to be asked thereby is whether all the ones screaming in favor of and hooray in relation to Charlie Hebdo machinations can still live in good conscience, given that it was through the fault of the cartoonists and satirists that the Islamist terrorist attack was suggestively and forcefully brought about, which has regrettably cost the life of many human beings. So the question is, when and if the screamers of in favor and hooray and proponents of the racist and terrorist instigation by Charlie Hebdo will one day have their intellect and rationality brought to bear, or if they will completely dumb down and thereby be even more unable to recognize and understand neither the reality nor the truth. As for the cartoonists and satirists of Charlie Hebdo, and also of the German satirical magazine Titanic, as well as the makers of other similarly following suit papers, magazines and newspapers, it is doubtful whether their sense of responsibility is still able to recognize their indecent doings, and whether there is still enough rationality and intellect left to make them stop their dangerous, ignominious, racist, terrorist doings.
In fact, the whole of this kind of doing will not be questionable, because to make it worthy of questioning, a certain better intelligence as well as responsibility would have to be given on the part of those who, in the wise you have mentioned, engage in satirical work and shamelessly produce and publish corresponding malicious and danger and terror-furthering caricatures. However, in the case of the fallible satirists and caricaturists, the necessary intelligence and sense of responsibility have either been very deficient from the outset, or everything was indeed developed in this respect, but has completely withered away in the course of time.
With this, we have also said everything that is necessary in this respect, because more would probably be of no use. Then I now have a question concerning your beam ships and other flying apparatuses, which can actually float as if weightless in the atmosphere and are not dragged by the gravity of the Earth, as your father Schwath already said. Can you tell me the reason for this in simple terms, unless this concerns a secret? If you are able to explain it in simple words, so that the whole thing can also be understood by the technically and physically uneducated human being, then it will be useful.
In all our flying apparatus, an anti-gravity state is created for the outer hull, wherethrough it becomes as if weightless for an external, that is to say planet-related gravitational force, and thus does not have to withstand any force of attraction. This, while in the interior area of the flying apparatus is a permanent and adapted to our living conditions, gravitational force prevails. Furthermore, our flying apparatuses generate an anti-gravitational force that is adapted to any external gravitational force, through which it is made feasible to neutralize the latter, wherethrough, from a standing position, very high speeds can be reached, without the passengers suffering harm, because they are protected by the inner gravitational state. Consequently, they are also not exposed to a gravitational pressure, as is the case. To the contrary, for example, with human beings of Earth in relation to earthly vehicles, flying apparatuses, that is to say, aircrafts and rockets, which are exposed to a gravitational pressure. Therefore, with all our flying apparatus, as a result of our highly developed gravitational technology, there never comes about a gravitational pressure, just as you have experienced it yourself.
Now I understand the whole thing a little better. Thank you for your explanation. What I want to ask you now relates to the 4 groupings of which you have spoken on various occasions, whereby you were able to identify 2 definitely. But then there are still the other 2, and what about them? Have you also gained insights on them?
That is so, yes. One relates to those foreign to the Earth and the other to earthly human activities, to which I, however, do not want to give a more detailed explanation.
That is also fine. Then I would like to come to talk about what you have told me on various occasions about the Area 51, about which...
You should, however, be silent, as I have clearly told you, because on the one hand it would not be advisable to spread the real truth about it, and on the other hand it would violate our directives if something were to become known. Hence, in each case, I told you everything only in absolute confidence and asked you to be silent about it.
I know, and I am abiding by that. After all, my question was only supposed to be whether you are able to tell me further things on a private basis. I did not want to know any more than that.
Excuse me, then I rushed to assume something wrong because I thought you would want to talk openly about the matter.
Of course not, because I am surely not breaking my word.
Excuse my false assumption. I really should refrain from such an assumption and furthermore know precisely that you never break a promise. As a matter of course, we can continue to talk about the whole matter of Area 51 in a purely private way.
But I may ask openly whether you know when it will one day be that the truth about Area 51 and the USA shadow government will be openly explained?
That is unknown to me.
Creating clarity would really be appropriate, yet of course this is indeed about the national security, as those in charge of the matter say. And so the truth is not supposed to become public.
That is the way it is, and it cannot be changed, also not by us, if we would release information on this matter, which, however, our directives fundamentally forbid us to do. But now I want to nevertheless ask you what you wanted to say when you talked about 3 articles that I may read. As you can see here, it's just 2 articles you gave me.
I do not understand that. But we did today the proofreading work with Bernadette. At that time, all 3 articles were actually included.
That may be so. But these were skipped and not corrected. Consequently, I did also not take cognizance of them and did not read them, something I just did with the 2 articles at the beginning of today's conversation.
Oh yes, of course. We skipped the articles during the correction because they had already been corrected in another way and will be corrected again, because they will also be published in a special bulletin. But you can read the 3rd article here in this printout of report. Which articles did you read and which one was missing?
It was one by Bernadette and one by Occam Wolf. These 2 articles I consider to be exceptionally good, and they contribute a lot to what you and I have discussed.
Then the one by Chris from Poland was missing, but this one is here within this report.
I can read it later at leisure if you give it along to me.
Of course. On that too, I would then, however, also like to hear your opinion.
Of course, also.
At our place, another novelty is due, because the old staple cutter in the print shop is slowly declining in its functions. Consequently, we must buy a new machine. Next week it is to be delivered. The old machine is known to you, because you once admired its technology.
That I can remember. It was still at the time when Engelbert was in command at the print shop. If it should be feasible, then I would like to have a look at the new device and capture it in pictures when it is delivered and not yet put into operation.
That can be done, which is why I will let Florina or Njana know when the staple cutter will be brought. So you will be able to still come here on the same day and marvel at the machine. And if this one too will again for 25 years do its job as well as the old model, then the Figu can be satisfied with it.
I think so too.
Should you now still be able to find some time to explain to me further things concerning the Area 51 and the shadow government in the USA, then please do so now, because at the moment I have no more questions, and I also cannot think of anything else that would still need to be discussed.
For my part, however, I have first still some things to discuss with you regarding...
Well, then let me hear what you have to say.
Firstly, I must point out that it is in the interest of if.
Which I will discuss with him, and also make it clear what your recommendation is.
Good, then I can now begin with the following.